Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture 33 of week 11 of the course Climate Change and Extreme Events. In the previous lectures, we have talked about advancement of climate extreme science. We have talked about different types of AI application in the remote sensing. We have also talked about how do we integrate the citizen science data set. How we have also talked about big data. We have also talked about how we can integrate all of them together, which are technological advanced techniques, and then we can use it for better insight of the climate extreme. So we have seen so many different advancement which has been done. People have already done that analysis in different parts of the world. They have also generated a very good understanding and results based on these advanced techniques. And then we have also talked about what is the future direction of these techniques in future steps like that. In this lecture, we will primarily talk about role of ecosystems in mitigating climate extremes. So why it is important? So if you look at this particular figure, it can this information is very clear. Suppose we have some sort of a coastal flooding and some sort of cyclone, storm surges, which are coming very frequently in a certain region. And in this particular region, let us say if you have some sort of mangrove forest which has been already developed near to the coastal areas. In another scenario, if you remove that mangrove or coastal forested region from that particular area, what would be the climate extremity in that particular region? If you can look at it here, you can see that when we have mangrove or forest areas which has a very high dense areas which are completely protecting the coastal because of these different types of extreme events, whether it could be storm surges, storms or coastal floodings like that. But when we do not have mangroves forest like that, it is higher possibility that the water will go inside that urban areas near to the coastal region and can damage the property and therefore damage the socio-economic conditions and all. So that is the one example that tells about what is the important role of ecosystem in managing the climate extreme. We cannot neglect their role, and we cannot if in a certain region if it has been substantially declined, we have to improve their availability in those regions like that. So therefore, this tells about the ecosystems are playing a very important role in mitigating the climate extremes like that. So in this lecture, we will primarily talk about the role of natural ecosystem in reducing climate extremes risk. We will explore the example of ecosystem based adaptation EBA. Then we will analyze case studies of successful ecosystem based interventions, and we will also talk about discuss policy implication and future directions like that. So what is the introduction of ecosystem services and climate resilience? Ecosystems provide services that protect against climate extremes. For example, if you look at this figure here, there are different types of services which are supporting services. For example, where we are looking at soil formation, primary productions, we are talking about nutrient cycling, we are talking about water cycling, we are talking about biodiversities. So that is a kind of a supporting services which is functional provided by the ecosystem that underpin all of the other services. There is a provisioning services. For example, we are talking about water supply, we are talking about food productions, we are talking about timber, we are talking about energy, we can talking about genetic diversities like that. So this is a products of ecosystem such as water, food and supply of raw materials. There is a cultural services where we are talking about inspirational or spiritual values, tranquility, cultural heritage, or recreational or tourism services like that. So in this we are talking about non-material benefits that results from the interactions with the natural environment. And there is some sort of regulating services where we are talking about air qualities, climate carbon storage, water flood or erosion, soil quality, water quality and all. So, here we are talking about natural processes such as water, which are how they are interacting, and air quality, purifications and all. So, these are the different types of services which are essential when we are maintaining the ecosystem services in a particular region. Why it is important? Because it will regulate the floods, it will regulate storms, can act as a storm buffering, it can be temperature moderation, it can be drought resistance as well. Some of the examples are, for example, you can talk about wetlands, you can talk about mangroves, you can talk about forested regions, you can talk about certain grasslands as well. So, what is the ecosystem based adaptation? When we are talking about biodiversity and ecosystem services as a part of adaptation strategy. So, basically what is the principle behind? We have some sort of systems knowledge, where we know about ecological structures, we know about the urbans, we know about the urban trees, wetlands, we know about the green roofs, like that, what is their ecological structures, what is their ecological functioning and processes, we know how wetlands provide flood protections and all. Then there is a, so system knowledge is basically the operational understanding of the biophysical and socio-economic relationship between the act of adopting ecosystem and the benefits of the providers. Then we have some sort of normative knowledge, where we have adaptation benefits, reduced damage from the floods, reduced mortality from the heat waves, basically these ecosystems. Then we have some sort of valuation information, social or economic valuation of flood protection benefits. So, this is a kind of a conceptualization and quantifying benefits from the valuation of EBA with respect to societal goals and values by which EBA is to be judged. Then there is a transformative knowledge, direct or indirect action that modified the ecological structures, for example, ecosystem management practices. So, it is basically meant for EBA can be facilitated to meet explicit individual and social goals, like that. So, these kind of the knowledge are very important when we are talking about ecosystem based adaptation of these ecosystems around the globes, like that. So, what is the principle here? Community involvements are required. We know we need to have some sort of sustainable approach and co-benefits. What is the overall benefit when we have the knowledge about all these? Low cost, scalable, or co-benefits for biodiversity and the livelihoods. So, this is a one example of mangrove for coastal flood protections. So, here we can see that when we are talking about coastal floods, wave energy reductions, sediment trapping, storm surge buffering, they are acting as like that. So, if we have mangroves there, it basically reduces the wave energy, flood wave energy, and then sediment trapping, which is coming from the coastal areas. Then we have also talked about the storm surge buffering as well. When we have mangroves in a certain region, it will protect coastal infrastructure and livelihood. When we have mangrove in a certain region, it will also provide nursery grounds for the marine life as well. So, therefore, if we do not have that forested region in that particular region, it will primarily affect the the constructions or infrastructure which are built close to the coastal areas, and there is a serious threat because of these ongoing storms or let us say high velocity waves towards the coastal areas, like that. So, these are the some of the example of these mangroves in areas like that. There is another example of the role of forests and watersheds in drought and flood management. If you talk about forested areas, they are water retentions. They basically can maintain the soil stabilization, and they also provide some sort of evapotranspiration balance. If you take example of Himalayan forest ecosystem and the flood control, or let us say if you are talking about the Amazon forest in the regional rainfall regulations. So, you can see here there are multiple processes which are linked to the flood management or the forested and watershed areas in that particular area. So, first wherever you see that this is, let us say 1A, 1B and 1C and 1D, that is provisioning services. Particularly they are talking about if we have forest land in a certain region that provides the timber fiber that is used for constructing construction purposes and all, energy purposes and all. When we are talking about these areas, we have food, we have chemical and medicinal products, and then we have also the water. There is a second services which provides these forest lands and areas, habitat for flora and fauna, or photosynthesis process, which is primary production of the green leaves and around the which sustain the forest. Then we have soil formations. We have high fertile soil because of this different types of processes which is occurring here, for example mulching and all. Then there is a nutrients cycling, which is also very beneficial in terms of productivity of a certain region. Then there is a pollination and seed dispersal, which is also very important to disperse the seed to the neighboring region, so that the forested region keep on expanding into different parts of the world like that, different parts of the regions like that. Then the third is regulating services, which is basically it stores the carbon below the ground or above the ground, purification of the air, purification of the water, and then chemical regulations, that is protection against the erosion and avalanches. It will also provide flood mitigations. It will also provide protections against the coastal erosion and storms. So, these are the benefits of having a forest in terms of regulating services like that. Then there we have cultural services, for example recreational, aesthetic, spirituality and education and all. So, therefore, the forest and watershed plays a very critical role when we are talking about drought and flood management in a certain regions. If we talk about, let us say Himalayan forest or Amazon forest or any other forest in different parts of the regions like that. There is another important role of this ecosystems in urban landscapes. So, urban green infrastructure and heat waves are very hot topic, and people are talking about this because the heat waves or urban heating phenomena are keeps rising across the whole world, and people are start thinking about modification of the infrastructure design across the world, so that they can mitigate that particular problem of heat wave or increasing temperature. So, the one component is how do we deal with this, basically the urban forest. We have to make some sort of forested region or some sort of green landscape within area, so that can be used, that can cool down that surfaces little bit, and therefore we have not very frequent heat waves. There is a green roofs, parks or wetlands is a concept which are appearing. Then what is the functioning of this? It will basically reduce the urban heat island, it will increase the stormwater absorptions, and therefore it will provide a better ecosystems in a particular regions like that. So, this is an example of one Singapore cities in a garden model, where we have buildings, where we have different plants, where we have plants also in the streets, that can be used to have some sort of a sustainable development, where we have forested or plantation within the city, so that can maintain the urban heat island or heat wave effect in a certain regions like that. There is another case study of the wetlands for flood controls in the Bihar region. Wetlands are very important, plays a very critical role or act as a buffer zone when you are talking about flood controls. So, for example, if you are talking about Bihar region, it is a frequent monsoon flooding region, where we have lots of rivers which are coming from Himalayas, and those basically flooded during monsoon period. What is the intervention? People have also started thinking about some sort of construction of some sort of walls, embankments and all, but basically it is a temporary solution. What is the long term solution for this? Restoration of the natural floodplains and the wetlands is the long term solutions, because from where we have basically it was present. Now we have, it has been it has been converted to some sort of land cover, but now we are going back to that original conditions, that if you restore those natural floodplains or wetlands, we would be able to lower down the risk of the flooding in that particular region as well. So basically people have started looking at some sort of wetland areas, marking with the wetlands with the GIS data set and all, and then they have done some sort of scenario analysis based on some sort of hydrological connectivity tools. So suppose if we have a wetland and near to the river, and if we have, let us say, some sort of hydrological connectivity with the river channel, if the we can do some sort of different scenarios or different flood events magnitude, how that particular wetland area will behave, and how that basically, if we do not have, let us say, wetland in a certain region, if we have wetland, how the flood will behave in different scenarios like that. So based on this, basically it will can be generate some sort of ecological restoration of that particular region, and can be used a model to basically revive those wetlands which has been already extinct or already has been gone because of some sort of land use practices as well. So I would like to tell here that when you are talking about these wetlands and all, the remote sensing data sets plays a very critical role. And when you have a remote sensing high resolution data set or multiple temporal record, we would be able to tell about, okay, which area has significant changes in terms of area of the wetland, where people of the local stakeholders should focus on those areas which has been primarily was the wet part of the wetlands. Now it has been converted into some sort of different land use practices as well. So that where we can use those remote sensing or cloud computing data set, integrating with some sort of sophisticated tools, for example, hydrological connectivity for scenario analysis. Once we do that, we would be able to tell about, okay, how this when we have no floodplain or let us say wetland in a certain region, how that particular scenario is giving you the flood response if you have the, let us say, wetland area in a certain regions like that. There is another case study of the coral reefs and storm surges reductions. So if you look at, this is a Caribbean island where we have natural breakwaters that reduce the wave heights. There is a constant threats of the coral bleaching and coastal development. So therefore, people have started restoring that coral areas in that particular region, so that they can protect the marine protected areas. And what is the advantage of this? Basically, that is basically keeping the preventing the suitable for the these areas, and also restoration basically they have done to basically restore the original position, original ecosystem in that particular area, so that we can have natural flora and fauna conditions like that. That can be used for storm surges reduction in that regions like that. So what is the challenges and limitation of the ecosystem based adaptation? One challenge is monitoring and evaluation. We need to have some sort of long term study, long term data set, long term record that can tell us about how the particular area of ecosystem has been changed over the past, let us say, 30-40 years. There the remote sensing data set or satellite data set comes into the play, and that data set can be used to give you more precise information about what is the long term change in the wetland or ecosystem services in a particular regions like that. What is the threats to the ecosystem that we need to know about? What is the human induced land use changes, for example, pollution or invasive species? What kind of the threat where these ecosystems are facing, and what could be the particular solution for that? So that is basically is important step forward. And then there is a implementation barriers. What is the funding? What is the land tenure? What is the limited awareness and all? That is also is important to aware to the local public about the functioning of these ecosystem services in a certain region. and how these ecosystem services are playing a very important role in mitigating the negative consequences of the climate extreme in a certain regions like that. How do we integrate, how do we implement these effective or challenges or to improve further through the policy integration and the global initiatives. For example, when you are talking about IUCN, which also focuses on the global conservation and efforts and nature based solutions to support adaptation and mitigations. If you talk about UNFCCC, which is also focuses on the global climate agreements and frameworks to reduce greenhouse gas emission and enhance the adaptation strategy. When you are talking about the CBD, basically conservation of the biological diversities, which also emphasize this, and the sustainable use of its component to support ecosystem services. When you are talking about the SDG, sustainable development goals, where we are providing a comprehensive agenda for sustainable development, including goals that support climate resilience and adaptation. When you are talking about UNEP or EBPA program, where we are promoting the ecosystem based adaptation and approach to enhance resilience against climate change impact. So, this is basically, these are the global initiatives, policy integrations. So, globally people have done some sort of framework which is looking towards these ecosystem restoration problem, and then they have formulated certain types of policies. Now, what is the important role is the national authorities or the local stakeholders or local authorities should take into account, should take that basically framework and that basically convert into the local level, and then basically adopt. If let us say there are several wetlands, they have to focus on restoring that wetland so that they can act as a buffer during the floods and drought conditions, and then provide water, or let us say absorb the water during the extreme climate events like that. So, therefore, it is very important to understand what is the role of ecosystem, why it is very significant in terms of managing the climate extremes in a certain region, and how these ecosystem based services offers a sustainable and multi benefit solutions. And also it is important to know that what kind of the policy support and long term investments are essential to protect these areas, so that we can mitigate the negative consequences of the climate extremes, more natural based solutions in a certain regions like that. So, in this lecture, this is for today's lecture. In the next lecture, we will talk about what is a summary of this week 11, and we will also talk about one assignment. So, you can go through that assignment, and you can we will discuss about this assignment in the next class as well. Thank you so much for your attention.